Ignister is insane, and even though it's currently an anime archetype out of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains anime, there's no reason we can't speculate the impact it would have on the TCG. So in today's video, we'll prominently blast our way through the effects, analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the deck, and see if this archetype has what it takes to become a tier 1 strategy. And before we start, if you guys want to support me further than just watching my YouTube videos, make sure you guys go check out my Patreon to not only help this channel, but get some awesome content out of it. A link will be in a card in the top right corner and in the description. With that, let's check out Ignister. So first off, what do we know about the archetype and, well, the cards in it so far? Well, before we can even talk about that, I need to give a disclaimer that all of these cards are indeed subject to change, depending on what happens between the transition from the anime into an actual card. So what we know is this is a Cybers based archetype, mainly revolved around extra deck summoning, being able to summon different types of monsters, actually making Firewall Dark Fluid Dragon pretty easily in this deck. And so let me actually explain what each card does individually if you do not know already, or let me reiterate what they do just so you guys get a better idea of how this deck does its thing. So let's start with Picari Ignister. This is a level 4 light Cybers effect monster with 1200 attack, 600 defense, and the following effects. If this card is normal or special summon, you can add one Ignister Island from your deck to your hand. So Ignister Island is a field spell for the deck, meaning you will probably only play one of this depending on how accessible Picari Ignister is. Again, we need to wait for more support to get more access to main deck Ignister monsters, and there will be support over time for the archetype in the anime that will eventually become TCG cards, but regardless, Picari gets us Ignister Island. So what does Ignister Island do? Well, Ignister Island is a field spell with the following effects. If you control no monsters in your main monster zone, you can special summon one level 4 or lower Ignister monster from your hand. Also, you cannot special summon monsters for the rest of this turn, except Cybers monsters, even if this card leaves the field. If this card in the field zone is destroyed by card effect, destroy all monsters you control. So this card is interesting. This helps us turbo out Ignister monsters from our hand. And if this is the primary way we were supposed to turbo out Ignister monsters from our hand, it's not really that great for us. That means that we have to draw Picari or Ignister Island. At max, we would have at least 9 copies with Signet Mining, Picari, this, and then we could play 2 Terraforming as well, making it 11, but I don't think this is going to be the end-all be-all to summoning Ignister monsters. So Ignister Island gets us a free special summon. It's not a once per turn special summon, which can be relevant. There is the restriction that we cannot summon monsters except Cybers monsters, but that's not really the biggest deal because we're probably summoning Cybers monsters only regardless. And the restriction that if it's destroyed by a card effect, destroy all monsters you control, that's actually a pretty big deal. So Fire King Island is a very similar card in that sense, because if you banish or destroy Fire King Island, you say goodbye to your field. And Ignister Island basically does the same thing. It makes spell and trap removal good against this deck. At the same time, however, there's a Synchro monster we'll get to that actually punishes your opponent for removing your field spell. Now you may be wondering with Ignister Island, well, that's great and all, we normal summon Picari, we get Ignister Island, but now we need to summon another monster from our hand. How do we do that? Well, we can link into the Link 1 Lingeribo. So Lingeribo is like Linkeribo, it requires one Ignister monster. That's not confirmed, but it's the assumption here, and it has the following effects. When your opponent activates a trap card quick effect, you contribute this card, negate the effect, and if you do, banish that card. If this card is in your graveyard quick effect, you contribute one Ignister monster that was special summoned from the extra deck. Special summon this card. Okay, so basically you summon Picari, you link into Lingeribo, you activate Island, and then you can summon another monster from your hand, which is great and all, but then we have to remember Lingeribo is actually pretty crazy. So this card just negates a trap card for free, banishes the card, and can revive itself. Now I'm assuming if it goes to the TCG, each effect will be a hard once per turn, which I'm pretty sure we can all assume that here. But that doesn't change how going second against any trap dot deck, you just summon Lingeribo and they're basically in a bad position here. that means none of their traps are going to be live unless they have a counter trap or a way to deal with the Linger-Evo. But Linger-Evo just applies immense pressure to trap decks because of that effect. Salamangreat's a great example of Linger-Evo being good. It forces out at least 2 back row to make sure Rage resolves against your deck. And it's pretty good because it can revive itself like Linger-Evo, which, I mean, it would make sense since Linger-Evo is the duplicate of Linger-Evo. Now, basically, all at Ignister monsters get you access to an extra deck monster, at least so far. So Bakari being a light level 4 means you can use it along with another level 4 in order to make Light Dragon at Ignister. So what does Light Dragon at Ignister do? Well, it's a rank 4 Cyberse Exceeds monster that requires 2 level 4 monsters, including a light monster as material. Its attack is 2300 attack, its defense is 1500, and it has the following effects. You can detach 1 material from this card, then target monsters your opponent controls up to the number of at Ignister monsters you control, destroy them. When another at Ignister monster inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can target one at Ignister Link monster in your graveyard, special summon it. You can only use each effect of Light Dragon at Ignister once per turn. So clearly this card is amazing going second, and actually solves one of the issues that Cyberse had that I addressed in my other video about Cyberse Pendulums, which you should go check out that video after this one. But basically, one of the problems was that deck doesn't really have that much good removal, and Light Dragon at Ignister just gives you that removal that you needed. Especially when you have this card along with other at Ignister monsters, then it becomes a big deal because you're clearing multiple cards at once. And worst case scenario, if you just attack with it or any at Ignister monster and it deals battle damage, you just reborn a Link monster from your graveyard that's an at Ignister monster. I mean, that's pretty good if you ask me. Very similarly, we have Bururu at Ignister, which is a card that is honestly not that great unless you can set it up. It's a level 3 wind Cyberse tuner monster with 600 attack, 400 defense, and the following effects. If this card is sent to the graveyard as synchro material for a Cyberse monster, you can target one other monster in your graveyard that was used as material for that synchro summon, special summon it. So basically this card is pretty good if you already have the setup for it. You synchro summon into the Cyberse synchro monster you want, which is either the at Ignister Winged Pegasus, or you synchro summon into a Cyberse Quantum Dragon, or whatever other Cyberse synchro monsters we get. So you use Bururu, and from there, you get to reborn another monster, which makes your combos more devastating. And you may be thinking this card is kind of meh unless you are able to set it up, and the question is then, can we set it up consistently? And actually you can, and I'll get to how you do that in a second. Remember though, we can summon it from our hand with Island, so there are ways to get it out of our hand and onto the field, not necessarily saying those are the most prominent ways. So basically the idea is Bururu gets you access to Wind Pegasus at Ignister, and Wind Pegasus at Ignister punishes your opponent for removing Island. So it's a wind level 7 Cyberse synchro monster that requires 1 wind tuner, 1 non-tuner monster. It has 2300 attack, 1500 defense, and the following effects. You can target spells and traps your opponent controls up to the number of at Ignister monsters you control. Destroy them. If a spell and trap card you control was destroyed by an opponent's card effect this turn, while this card is in your graveyard quick effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard, then target one monster your opponent controls, shuffle it into the deck. You can only use each effect of Wind Pegasus at Ignister once per turn. Very similarly to Light Dragon, this one deals with spells and traps instead of monsters. However, it has a different secondary effect, which punishes your opponent for dealing with any spells and traps you control at all. If your opponent deals with the island, that still punishes your opponent in some way, and you're not necessarily going fully neg. You are going neg, but it's not as bad with Wind Pegasus in your graveyard, because you can just use its effect at any point. And lastly, we have Doyon at Ignister and Dark Templar at Ignister. So Doyon is the Dark level 4. That reads, if this card is normal or special summoned, you can target one at Ignister monster in your graveyard, add it to your hand. You can only use this effect of Doyon at Ignister once per turn. We're just recurring one of our at Ignister, either using it for more link spam, or it's just good for having a follow-up for the next turn. You can also somehow summon it on your opponent's turn and get more advantage from there by recurring a monster again. But that's not the main thing with this card. The main thing is it's an Ad Ignister Dark monster, and the reason why that's good, regardless of recurring resources from the grave, is using it with Dark Templar Ad Ignister. So this card is the replacement for Decode Talker. This is the alternate Decode Talker, if you will. And oh my goodness, this card is good. But it has a lot of text, so bear with me for a second. Its attribute is Dark. It's a Link 3 Cybers monster with bottom left, bottom, and bottom right arrows. It requires 3 Cybers monsters, including a Dark monster as material, and it has the following effects. Cannot be destroyed by battle with a monster that has the same attack. If this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can target one Ad Ignister monster in your graveyard. Special summon it to your zone this card points to. If a monster is special summoned to your zone your Link monster points to, you can target one Link monster you control, special summon as many level 4 or lower Ad Ignister monsters with different names from your graveyard as possible to your zones the targeted monster points to, but negate their effects. You can only use this effect of Dark Templar Ad Ignister once per turn. Okay, yeah, that second effect, the one that special summons at minimum 2, is pretty good if you ask me. Because basically you have to summon a monster to at least one zone of Dark Templar, but then Dark Templar can revive 2 more from the graveyard, which makes it just incredible. Don't get me wrong, Transcode is a card, but when you're combining Transcode and Dark Templar in the same combo, then oh man, you can do some shenanigans. You can abuse the heck out of this card pretty easily. It requires 3 Cybers monsters, which is no biggie because we have plenty of Cybers monsters that would fit the criteria for Dark Templar, making it just that much better and easier to summon. It's really not that hard to summon, it just requires a dark monster. The other effects aren't necessarily as relevant, although destroying an opponent's monster by battle and reborning an Ad Ignister monster is still really strong and makes this card better as the game goes on. However, I think the big appeal of it is you can reborn 2 monsters from your graveyard by targeting it with its second effect once you special summon a monster to a zone it points to, making that effect all around really good. The only issue is it has to revive Ad Ignister monsters specifically, which isn't really the worst thing ever, but it definitely hurts. Especially because you can't revive any other Cybers monsters, which means you probably want to play this more specifically in just Ad Ignister. But if you can mesh together generic Cybers monsters and Ad Ignister, or if Ad Ignister gets better main deck monsters, which we'll talk about that in a little bit, but if they get better main deck monsters, then Dark Templar just keeps getting better and better. I'll definitely have another video or 2 in the future to talk about Ad Ignister and see where they're at in the anime and basically catch up with them. But as of now, these are the first 8 cards introduced in the anime for Ad Ignister. So what are the strengths? Well, it's amazing cyber support generically. I mean, think about it. If you're able to mesh the 2 strategies together of pure cyber / co-talker and the Ad Ignisters, it can honestly get pretty crazy. Dark Templar already is reviving monsters. You have Transcode Talker to revive monsters. There is easy ways to link spam in the deck. It's really solid. Honestly, I think Linkuribo is a great card for this archetype. There's definitely a lot of ways for this deck to go off. And I think the other big thing is Wind Pegasus and Light Dragon solve the removal problem from before. As long as you can get access to the 2 monsters, I mean, it's not as generic as something like Nightmare Phoenix and Nightmare Unicorn, but those aren't Cybers monsters and these are Cybers monsters. Those being Cybers monsters having really solid removal effects definitely make them something to look out for. And this deck actually destroys any Trap Dot deck because of Linkuribo. And lastly, this is a Cybers archetype, so any cyber support helps this archetype, like Signet Mining, Transcode, etc. So there are flaws, I will not deny. There are definitely flaws for this archetype, so what are they? Well, there aren't any good Ad Ignister main deck monsters. We see that we have Picari, we have Bururu, and we have Doyon, but none of them are really that strong. I'm sure Bururu would be an important one of in the future, but really right now, are you really going to be able to combo that hard with the main deck monsters we have? Unless you're using Bururu and whatnot? No, I don't really think so. The main deck monsters just aren't strong enough. There aren't enough of them. And the other 2 are just very meh overall. I'm sure they'll be played, but I really don't see this archetype being successful without more main deck monsters. They also need a better turn 1. So right now, we have plenty of going second cards, but where are all the going first cards? Dark Templar helps you spam, Wind Pegasus and Light Dragon are good for going second, but everything else is meh going first, except for Linger-Ebo. But not every deck is playing a trap card that you want to use Linger-Ebo on. So yeah, no, Linger-Ebo doesn't solve all of the problems immediately. If we got more cards like Linger-Ebo that can negate monsters and spells, which I doubt would happen, but if that does happen, that'd be incredible for the archetype. But right now, that's 100% not the case. This archetype has potential if it was released in the TCG to be solid. While there are definitely issues and we may not even get this deck in real life, we still have another year of reigns to go before this archetype is done in the anime. And with all of that in mind, you should be on the lookout for Adagnister, because it's likely they could receive some pretty good support and potentially make this deck tier 1 if it ever comes out in the TCG. Thanks for watching.